Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for a talk and Q&A with curator Jordan Rockford and visual artist Lorenzo Triburgo. My name's John Thompson, and I'm the art gallery director at Penn State Abington, and I'm glad you can all join us for this art gallery virtual program. Today we'll see presentations by Jordan and Lorenzo, followed by a conversation and Q&A session. If you have any questions during the presentations, I encourage you to enter them in the chat, and we'll do our best to get to them during the Q&A. I'd like to particularly welcome the Penn State Abington community, as well as any and all visitors we have from the University of the Arts in Philadelphia and Oregon State University. As the conversation presented here will center on gender, I want to invite everyone to include your pronouns on Zoom if you would like. You can do this by clicking anywhere on your own photo or video, selecting rename, and adding your pronouns after your name. I'd like to now introduce our participants. Jordan Rockford is a Philadelphia-based independent curator. Projects include exhibitions for the Delaware Art Museum, the William Way LGBT Community Center, and the University of the Arts, where he is also on faculty. He has published essays in the contemporary photography magazines Ain't Bad and GUP, and is a design consultant for Mural Arts Philadelphia. Jordan received his BFA in photography from the University of the Arts in Philadelphia and his master's in art history from the University of St. Andrews in Scotland. In winter 2017, Jordan curated a group exhibition for the art gallery at Penn State Abington titled Where We Find Ourselves, which featured the work of Lorenzo Triburgo, who is also joining us today. Lorenzo Triburgo is a Brooklyn-based artist employing performance, photography, video, and audio to cast a critical lens on notions of the natural, the construct of gender, and the politics of queer representation. They have artworks in the permanent collection of the Museum of Contemporary Photography in Chicago and the Portland Art Museum in Portland, Oregon. Lorenzo has exhibited and lectured in cities throughout the US, Europe, and Asia. Lorenzo was awarded a workspace residency at the Baxter Street Camera Club of New York in 2019 and was a 2020 AIM Fellow at the Bronx Museum of the Arts. They hold a BA from New York University in Photography and Gender Studies and an MFA in Photography and Related Media from the School of Visual Arts in New York. Lorenzo teaches critical theory, art, and gender studies for Oregon State University's online campus. And now, after those introductions, I'd like to turn things over to Jordan.
Thanks, John. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. Really glad to see all these faces and names, many of which I don't know, so you're all new folks. That's awesome. I'm going to go right ahead and jump right into my slideshow here. Bear with me a sec. Okay, so when John reached out today to both Lorenzo and I, he was interested in our kind of approaching this from both a curatorial and artistic standpoint. So I wanted to give a brief presentation on some of my curatorial background, just a snapshot, as it were, that kind of led up to working both with John and with Lorenzo. And so what I'm looking at in my curatorial history is queer representation, presence, and invisibility. And when I was pulling this show together for this particular group, I realized a really interesting aspect of the beginning of my curatorial career. And that is that back in 2004, when I was fresh out of grad school, I was invited to co-curate an exhibition of two photographers for Equality Forum, which is an international forum on LGBT civil rights that takes place in Philadelphia. And the colleague who invited me to work on this project called me into his office and basically just sat me down and said, "So how comfortable with you are with being out? And how visible do you want to be about that?" That was how he invited me to work on this show. And this was the first exhibition I ever worked on. It was right after my degree at St. Andrews, which was in art history and museum work. But I hadn't really done any contemporary curating up to that point. And that was the very start in this very first curatorial project. When I first understood that being a curator was work in which I would continually explore my own identity and kind of question my visibility in the world, while also being able to create a platform and visibility for others. So it really kind of drove home what curating could be for me. And when I look back at that and I realize it's not surprising that many of the artists I've worked with since then have been queer or have made work around issues of gender and identity, because these are things that are important for me, but they're also key elements of how I understood curatorial practice. So these are just two images from David Hilliard, the image on the top, and Ryan McGinley, in fact, neither of them were ones we included in that show at the time, but they're two images of theirs that I really like that I wanted to include in this show. So jumping ahead in time, and I'm not going to be linear here, I'm going to be all over the map. Shortly after joining the faculty at UArts, I also joined a fledgling artist collective and gallery space called Napoleon. This is where I first met John. And over the years there, I curated several shows. And there are two of them today that I'd like to talk about briefly. And this is the first, and it is by the artist Chad States. It was a show called Night Sweats. We did that in 2014. Up until this point, Chad States had been known as a photographer, working actually with queer spaces. His photographic work documenting gay cruising spaces in particular is work that he'd published and was known for. And that in and of itself was a project that explored both presence and invisibility, because it looked at public spaces being used for private uses. And so I was following his work. I was very interested in his work, but he was interested in kind of breaking out of the photographic and into sculptural installation. And this was actually his first show doing that. And this is a mode he has worked in since then. So this is the opening of the gallery space. And then what Chad created was essentially a dark room in our gallery. And let me tell you, painting your gallery completely black is a big thing to turn back around. But he created this space that sort of invited people into a very intimate space that centered around this sculptural piece that also included a photograph, and that questioned sort of issues around bodies and closeness and violence and sensuality. It was a really interesting direction to take, coming right out of the photographic work he was doing. And in that same year, I also mounted this show for the William Way Center, LGBT Center in Philadelphia, called Love and Devotion. And this was a dual show, two artists, Be Proud, who was a colleague of mine at University of the Arts, and Anthony Osso, who is a filmmaker based in New York, both of whom were making work about LGBT couples in long-term relationships. And this was during a time when establishing a visible history of queer relationships and families was really crucial to the fight for marriage equality. And so that was kind of at the heart of the work that they were both doing. Barb's project, Be Proud's project, was called First Comes Love, and it was a book project and a photographic exhibition. And Anthony's project was a documentary series of short documentary films called The Devotion Project. So of course we called it Love and Devotion. And it was really, really amazing to work with them, and also honestly with a lot of the subjects of their films and photographs for this project, because we involved a lot of them in the opening of the exhibition and in a series of public talks around that time. So that was really great, and I really enjoyed that. Over the years, I've actually curated several projects for the William Way Center. Another one, and this is not, again, chronological, was working with the Cambodian artist Lino Woot. And this was actually his first US exhibition. And I have to say that throughout my curatorial practice, I've really been honored. It's been a great honor to work with artists from other countries and other cultures, and to bring an international perspective to both my practice, but also to the spaces I work in. And Lino was an amazing person to work with. We were connected through colleagues who had worked with him in Cambodia, who actually ran a dance company. So it was a really interesting kind of crossover. But he was, in addition to a lot of different projects that he was doing, he was working on this photographic project called Tomada. And Tomada means the usual. And it was a word that Lino used for this project to talk about how queerness is the usual, it is normal, and that it's queer identity is something that is part of the greater community. And in this work, Lino documented queer Cambodians with their partners and their families. And here's another example of it. This piece actually is called The Makeup Artist, and it's the story of Dareth and Cameroon, who are on the moped and the image on the left, and how their families sort of engaged them when they both came out. So this was a really interesting project to work with from that standpoint of seeing how queer culture was happening, and the struggle for queer identity, but also the visibility of queer identity in other cultures and what that looked like and how other artists were exploring that and approaching that. And it was really quite a pleasure working with Lino. And then more recently, in fact, most recently, this is the most recent exhibition I've worked on, and it's amazingly still on the walls. Thank you, COVID, because we opened it a year ago. In fact, a year ago, like right about today. But I worked with the Mexican artist called Nelson Morales, who documents Muxe culture in Oaxaca. And so outside of Mexico, Muxe identity might seem analogous with the term transgender. I think that's largely how this work might be seen in the US. However, Muxes are traditionally considered a third gender and are respected in the Zapotec communities of Oaxaca, much like the role of Two-Spirit members of indigenous communities of the North in parts of what is now called the US and Canada. So this work came to my attention, and I actually was able to meet with Nelson when I was in Mexico City, and was really pleased to bring him and his work to the University of the Arts. I opened with this really lovely image of an article in the New York Times of his work. Here's some other images from the series. And I think what is most interesting to me about this work is that it not only makes visible a living legacy of pre-colonial gender identities, but also there's this other sort of hidden, if you will, actually unhidden aspect of this work. And that is that as Morales was working in these communities and documenting the Muxe culture, he really started to recognize a resonance in himself with Muxe identity, and really started sort of exploring and questioning his own gender identity and sort of the default that he'd been in, and ended up making a series of self-portraits alongside these works exploring that. And so I love this process, this project, because the work was really very perspective changing, not only for its audience, but for its maker. And I think that that's one of the best roles that art can play, that it's not just something that's being made for others to look at, but it is in fact a process for the maker. And it ends up becoming this bridge, you know, between people around understanding, and in this case, around identity. These are a few installation shots from the gallery, the photography gallery at the University of the Arts, where I certainly hope these things are still happily on the wall. And then I bring it back now to sort of what brings us all here today, which is the exhibition I curated in 2017 for Penn State Abington, which is called Where We Find Ourselves. And this includes a series of artists, which you can see popping up here now. And this was a show that John reached out to me and asked me to curate for Penn State, which we then traveled to UArts. So this show had sort of a double life. And it was really a really amazing experience to work with this show. I'll start here with an image of the gallery space, which anyone here from Penn State will be familiar with. Let me tell you, this is one of the best galleries I've ever worked with. It was such a beautiful modern space with amazing lighting. It was a huge pleasure to work in this space. And when I started pulling this show together, what I wanted to look at, I was especially thinking about the Penn State community, and I wanted to find a way to look at how queer identity is reflected in the mainstream, is part of the mainstream. There's a common thread of culture that we all share and that we see ourselves reflected in different ways. And so that's why I called it Where We Find Ourselves. And I looked at artists who are making work around how they found their identity reflected in the greater culture surrounding them, and how in some cases they adopted, adapted, or subverted that from contemporary culture. And we worked with artists all over the US, many of whom came from an international background. So we were getting different perspectives culturally as well. And that was really very important for me in this show. The frontispiece, as it were, for the gallery space was this work by Jamil Helou, who is an artist of, he's Middle Eastern descent, raised in Brazil, now is a US citizen living and working in San Francisco. It's a long story. And so this work was, the piece you're looking at here is actually a lenticular piece. And I don't know if you all know those pieces, but it's like those postcards you get that you turn them back and forth and the image shifts. And so this is a large piece like that changed between him dressed traditionally, quote unquote, for his culture, and then in leather gear. And it was exploring where those two identities sort of hid one another, overlapped one another, coexisted with one another. And we put this in the front so that as people walked past the gallery, they'd get this shifting effect of identity. And one of the artists I brought into the show was Lorenzo, hence us all being here today. And in fact, this work from their Trans Portraits series accompanied the exhibit text in the gallery space. And I know that Lorenzo will talk more about that. And then I'm just going to wrap up really quickly with the last show I curated for the Napoleon space, which was called Signal Boost. I co-curated this with Raphael Soldi from the Strange Fire Collective. And was working with different artists who had been either part of or interviewed by Strange Fire over the years. And Lorenzo was one of those artists. So in addition to Lorenzo's work, we also featured work by Zora J. Murph and Juan Geraldo. And the work that Lorenzo had in this show was two pieces from the Policing Gender series, which I believe Lorenzo will also talk about. And I'm out of time. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Lorenzo as soon as I can find the stop share button on this. Oh, I think it's hiding underneath all of you. Yes, there it is. Thank you.
Jordan, that was really incredible overview of your work, and really, I think, set us up nicely for the context of our talk. So thank you for that. I also want to say thank you for having me and inviting me here today to have this conversation, both Jordan and John and everyone at Penn State. So thank you very much for having me. I'm really excited to be here. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen in the interest of time and just kind of also jump in. One moment, I'm going to make sure I checked that box to share audio, and I did. Okay, good. Okay, does that look okay, everyone? Okay, cool. So yeah, again, thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me. And thank you, Oregon State people. I see you in the house, so I appreciate you coming to show your support as well. Yeah. So I'm going to I have about 20 minutes to talk, and I'm going to talk about, I think, 4 or 5 projects. So I normally would kind of give more historical context and even more cultural context to my projects. But what I'm going to try to do here is just give an overview of some ideas that I've been working with over the last, whatever, 10, 12 years, and then kind of leave a lot of topics open for discussion at the end. So in 2008, I came out as trans, and I wanted to make a project, but not something diaristic or narrative, not just my story, and also not something that would sort of, not a photography project that would give viewers access to like the souls of the people who I'm photographing. I really wanted the project to be about ideas on gender and on US American masculinity. And the idea that, all gender is something that's dictated by social norms, even though it's still talked about and treated as naturally occurring. The phrase and the idea, boys will be boys, right, is still very much present in our US American culture. So in 2008, and I was thinking about this when Jordan was saying, in 2004, you were asked, how out do you want to be? I feel like it's important to remember that even though it's still the 2000s and maybe not that long ago, there was little conversation in mainstream media about queerness, but in particular, little conversation about transgender rights, and the depictions available of trans people were, grossly offensive, and in the fine art world seemed to really focus on tragedy, and in photography in particular, the sort of before and after, which is a highly problematic trope. So with trans portraits, I wanted to create positive representations and sort of add to the universe's library of images of transgender guys so that we would have representation. And during this time, again, 2008 to 2013, this felt really important and urgent. So in order to visually convey the notion of gender as a construct, I wanted to depict the natural as a fabrication. And after working in the studio with various methodologies, including projections and collage for the backgrounds, I decided that the depiction should really be in paint. Because after all, the narrative of American masculinity, US American, was originally visualized and mythologized in paint. Thinking about Davy Crockett and, Conquer the West, manifest destiny. And we all know what that actually meant. So having never painted anything before in my life, I did what any self-respecting artist would do, which is turn to Bob Ross and make oversized landscape paintings based on the instructions from his Joy of Painting workbooks. So there are 30 portraits in the series, and each has their own oil painted landscape. And I'm just gonna. So this is just some, behind the scenes studio. Yeah. And yeah, Humboldt State University has kind of made a beautiful compilation of the work in a catalog. And with a forward by Eliza Steinbach, who's the Transgender Studies Quarterly academic journal, one of the editors there. I also wanted to say, but over the course of the 5 years that I made the project and continuing on, it's been really exciting to see how the conversations around trans identity and trans rights have shifted. People's awareness of trans issues and trans rights it's just way more present, and it's really exciting to be able to talk about, for example, trans portraits and the ideas around portraiture, and not have the conversation necessarily stop at what does transgender mean. So that's been really interesting and kind of an exciting part of this project, to think about it being as part of the work that made some of that progress possible, is what I like to think about. So in 2014, Time magazine pronounced the transgender tipping point. And we all know that, media representations of trans people were increasing, if not in quality, at least in quantity. But in my own experience, again, I didn't have to define the word transgender to people from scratch, so to speak. And this was due to the work of activists and artists for decades prior to this. At the same time, around this time, again, 2014, I felt like I felt a tokenizing of trans people happening. Again, I was seeing fixations with before and after, and then media being kind of very clearly to me created for not trans audiences necessarily, but for cisgender straight audiences that sort of relied on sympathy as a communication tool, sort of like, it's okay to like trans people now. They're born that way with something wrong with them. But if they have surgery, then they're just like me and you. And so this is part of the commodification of trans bodies and trans stories that I started to see happening. And it's sort of the visibility trap, right? So during that same time period, I received a grant for a project addressing mass incarceration from a queer perspective. I became pen pals with over 30 LGBTQ prisoners and wrote with them on a monthly basis for 2 years. I wanted to make portraits, and I could have. I actually worked to gain access to jails and prisons, but decided that I didn't want to commodify my pen pals' representations and give in to voyeuristic curiosities. I decided to make figureless portraits like this one for Rye. So I'm thinking, jail cells have been pictured and caricatured subconsciously. If I photograph inside a prison, in those spaces with the visual symbolism of concrete and bars and locks, I felt like they would signify criminality. And there's too many visuals that link those spaces to violence and danger for me to visually overcome that. So instead, I worked with my pen pals to record their stories. And there's an audio component in which you hear their voices. And then it also incorporates ambient noises from field recordings created while in the correctional facilities that I had worked to gain access to. So the absence of people in the photographs in this project is both working to speak to the absence of people in our communities because they're locked up, but it's also an acknowledgement of my unwillingness to allow viewers to gape. So I made backdrops using fabric, which symbolize or have symbolized, wealth, power, and beauty for centuries in portraiture. And I lit them as if for portraits. And as hopefully you'll be able to tell, like lighting for me is, I don't know, I feel like it's very meditative. I really love lighting. That to me is my medium, so to speak. And as I was working in the studio, I was just thinking about everything that I was learning about the prison industrial complex and the stories that my pen pals were sharing with me. So the resulting sort of feel of the image is about, is a result of where I was coming from as I was making the pictures. And I don't want to risk sensationalizing my pen pal's pain, which is actually why I never share the letters, or I haven't ever shared the letters that I've exchanged with my pen pals. And I don't often talk about the stories, but I will share that, for example, one of my pen pals on the inside worked for a major US company doing customer service and over the phone, like in a phone bank, and they got paid $1.65 an hour. And if a customer were to say, "Oh, where are you from?" They would just say Oregon. And if they were like, "Oh, but where specifically," or whatever, they would have to say, "Hold on," and immediately transfer the call to a manager. So there's just so much about the prison system, little things like that, right? All these little stories of abuse and that we don't hear about regularly. I think there's a lot of statistics, 2.5 million people behind bars, right? But there are also these stories where it's just this daily abuse. Also labor, right? So let's not forget to link the prison system to the economic system. And there's obviously incentive to get people behind bars in order to provide a labor force that is working at $1.65 an hour. So again, in Policing Gender, I'm sort of intentionally depriving viewers an ability or their maybe desire to gape. And I feel like sometimes maybe, this might be disappointing to viewers, especially someone, saying, "Oh, it's a photography project called Policing Gender, and it's about the prison system from a queer perspective." They might be expecting to see prisoners. And for me, that disappointment is something that I'm actively working with and quite frankly, okay with. Black and white aerial images photographed from a hot air balloon live alongside the figureless portraits and the audio piece. And these symbolize surveillance and perceptions of freedom. So when they're installed, I kind of see them as contextualizing the work. And I made the pictures this way because hot air balloons were actually used to create the first aerial reconnaissance images during the Civil War. And I think that was perhaps the first time photography was used in service of grand surveillance. Sometimes the work is installed with audio cones, like you see here at the Museum of Contemporary Photography. Sometimes it's installed with headphones. This is a 1-minute clip of the 15-minute piece, the audio piece, but I'm going to play about 30 seconds of it for you.
On my intake sheet where security issues, it says homosexual.
When you're handcuffed, they'll be escorting you. They'll smash your head in the floor, knock your teeth out. It happens. You'd be surprised.
So I have a goal of bringing Policing Gender to all 50 states in the US. My partner was like, "Why? Why do you want to do that?" And I was like, I want to plant little seeds of prison abolition throughout the US. And for every exhibition of the work, I make it a point, and I've committed to creating programming that facilitates community engagement and fosters conversation around the importance of prison abolition, and just educating people. What is the prison industrial complex? Why is this important, and why is this a critical queer issue? So this is just an example. I worked with the storytelling event Tell, and organized a policing gender version where formerly incarcerated LGBTQ identified people came and shared their stories. During a 5-day artist residency with the Kansas City Art Institute, I worked with students to create, we did workshops, and they started making projects. And I created a projection that was the size of a solitary confinement cell that the students then populated, beginning the projects with the work that they created in my workshops, and then continuing to work on them throughout the term, even after I left. And why the solitary confinement cell? And that was because LGBTQ prisoners are put in solitary confinement at higher rates than non-LGBTQ prisoners, often just as a kind of basically as a way of abuse, but often coded in the excuse that it's for their own safety. Meanwhile, the UN has acknowledged solitary confinement as a form of torture. This was after a presentation that I gave at a conference in Switzerland, and I asked anyone who was willing to join in a selfie so I could take a picture and then share that with my pen pals. So things like that. I do card writing, letter writing. Someone from Switzerland is actually now writing with a prisoner in the US, so I link up people. Yeah, so I think that's really important because I really want to be sure that the project isn't just aesthetic. As a result of policing gender in 2019, I was invited to co-curate a show at Amos Eno Gallery in Brooklyn, and I ended up titling it "Criminalize This: The Social Policing Gender and the Criminalization of Queerness." And we ended up having 70 artists in the show, from emerging to established, including Gabrielle Garcia Ramon, who's one of my favorite photographers, and Slava Magutin, who is also an amazing photographer and was the first person granted amnesty in the US for being gay and coming from Russia. So I want to just point this out too, that we wanted to create a space, not only like, again, this show, but a space for the month that was just full of ideas for a better future and a space for queer imagining. Mary and I hosted, Mary Gagler is the co-curator, hosted prisoner card writing events, a zine making workshop, and a night of performance art. During New York City Pride 2018, I stood in front of the Stonewall Inn, often cited as the birthplace of the LGBTQ civil rights movement, for 24 hours, from Friday midnight to Saturday midnight. And I created this project with my partner, Sarah Van Dyke. So I wanted to stand as an homage to the trans activists of color who stood up to the police at Stonewall Inn and are now understood as the initiators of our liberation movement. I'm thinking about Marsha P. Johnson, Sylvia Rivera, and Stormy DeLavery. So I'm just going to scroll through some of the 3,500 images that we made, but this is also a stop motion video. It was actually a really pretty cold day. It was June, it was Pride, but it was pretty chilly. And this was like, I call this picture finally a shadow, because there was no sun almost the entire time. There was literally like a 10-minute period at around 2 o'clock in the afternoon where the sun came out. This is one of 2 out trans women police officers who offered me a cup of coffee and gave us her card and said if we have any issues to get in touch with her ASAP. People gave me things to hold, did selfies with me. It was pretty incredible. And then just here's a couple of behind the scenes. Just screenshots from Instagram. Oh, hey, Julia, you're here. And you gave that a like, thanks. And then Sarah and I have been doing sort of guerrilla screenings around the city. And so during Pride Month, I think this year we're going to do it even more formally, but we've just been kind of, we got a little portable projector and have been showing it around the city. The last project I'll talk about in 3 minutes is Shimmer Shimmer, also created with Sarah. So when I started my artist residency with Baxter Street CCNY, I decided to stop taking testosterone after 10 years of hormone therapy, right? So it's full circle. I started trans portraits when I came out as trans and started taking testosterone. And this is really, I think of as a durational performance and an exploration of my body as a site of literal and metaphorical gender abolition. Again, now linking back to prison abolition. My body's metamorphoses towards gender ambiguity became source material for Shimmer Shimmer, which is an ongoing series of figurative and still life photographs. The figurative images feature my glitter-adorned nude form and familiar gendered art historical poses photographed by my partner, Sarah, at the historically gay section of Free Speech in New York City, which is now a haven during the summer months for New York City queers. The shimmer of glitter on my figure suggests a mythical celestial presence and hints at a connection to astrology, which is an important mode of connecting for us and our queer community. The still lifes of glitter as constellations with titles such as sextile and conjunction, featured here, reiterate this connection and signal to the viewer that the titles of the figurative images, such as Pluto, refer to the planet and not the gendered god. Here's a short time lapse of Sarah and I doing one of the shots. And notably, we did them in the winter. We worked on them primarily January through March 2020. Because this, if you just Google re-speech, R-I-I-S speech, it is really crowded. There's like no way. So these were all made in the winter months of 2020. So this is the image that you just watched the time lapse of us creating. So this is Seoul. This was photographed in March 2020, which was actually on the last full moon before the world shut down. And so the performative demedicalization of my body layered atop subtle gestural shifts of my hip position or shoulder height, and the metaphorical use of glitter as a representation of change itself, ever elusive and perceived differently according to light, culminate in binaries coming undone and collapsing into one another or being non-existent where one might expect them to surface. And here I've just included a glitter detail because when you see the prints in person, you can see this, but sharing them on the screen, I feel like you can't really see the detail in the images. So just wanted to share that. Thank you again for having me here. And I'm really excited to have a conversation and open to any and all questions. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Jordan and Lorenzo. So I think we're going to transition into a conversation here with Jordan and Lorenzo. People are welcome to join in. I'll be moderating the chat, and so if people have questions, you're welcome to enter them in there. If you want me to read them for you, we'll get to as many as we can. And if you want to ask your question audibly, just throw your hand up virtually, and we'll try to get to you there as well.
All right, Lorenzo, thank you. That was awesome. I mean, I know all your work, but I had not seen that lineup, and it was really nice to see it in that linear timeline. So I guess I'm just gonna start off with this question, and we'll go from there. You know, this one literally, like, to this morning as I was thinking about this, kind of coalesced in my mind. But I'm thinking about the most recent work. I'm thinking about Shimmer Shimmer, and I'm thinking about the precedent that already exists in contemporary art, where photography is utilized to recast or to question traditional fine arts, such as painting and sculpture, which you have a history of in your work generally, in some ways, and particularly around issues of gender and identity. And two artists that immediately come to mind are Yasumasa Moimura and his Daughter of Art Histories series, but also the artist Castles and their Becoming an Image performances, which I feel really fortunate to have caught one at Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts a few years ago. It was kind of amazing. But they both utilize photography in that questioning and recasting in different ways. And I definitely feel like Shimmer Shimmer is part of this canon. The question I have about that and what you think about this is, you know, photography so often is looked at as a tool, right? In fact, one of my students the other day was just saying how they got into photography because they wanted to be an artist, but they didn't have any other artistic skills. which I think a lot of us who studied photography can definitely, we know that vibe, right?
Have you seen my paintings?
Exactly, right? So clearly there's that aspect of photography as tool to do something. But I think that especially in these works, and especially when other forms of quote unquote traditional art and forms of the past are being recast and are being questioned, I think photography actually plays a really unique and really crucial role in that. And I'm interested what your perspective on that, on what the alchemical property of photography is in making these works.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. Well, so first of all, I love working with photography, not just because I can't paint or draw, but because there's so many built-in social expectations around it. Like, okay, so yes, it's a tool, but then there's also this idea that it's telling us the truth. Then there's the idea that it's saving our memories for us, that it's, and at least now that it's, a way into someone's soul, right? A photograph of looking into someone's eyes. So there's so many expectations that already exist within a photograph. And then it's also such a, the language of photographic images is more and more available to people as we're all making images and sharing them with each other. Like we know what duck face is, for example, right? Like it's like there are things that we just know now, and it's we know them because we're communicating through photography. So I love that. Like I feel like that's one way in which photography will always be interesting because it's always evolving based on the way people use it. I know that's not exactly your question, but to me, just that's sort of why photography for me. Yeah, and I love the references like Yasimasa Muramura, one of my favorite artists when I was coming of age, right in the 90s, coming of age as an artist myself, and Castles too. Castles is an amazing artist. And I think that, so I've gotten this question about like, is Shimmer Shimmer about like documenting the performance? And it's like, no, the thing with Shimmer Shimmer is that I've really, I'm working on different installation ideas for future shows, but I was really, for the first show, I was working for an exhibition that opened in October. It was a solo show. It was the culmination of my residency at Baxter Street. And it was, for me, really about having beautiful photographic prints. And that's kind of why I also wanted to show you the detail, because for me, the print is also really important to the work and to my process. But yeah, so for me, it's really about the light. Mixing artificial and natural light, I think, is also, it lends a camp aesthetic to it, but it's also kind of an interesting kind of conversation about what's natural and what's not, thinking about sources of light metaphorically too. I think I rambled on, so now I don't know that I've actually answered your question, but.
Well, I think you've taken it to an interesting new place, actually, because when I think about, especially what you've just said about the importance of the print to your work and to that work in particular, is really interesting. In a sense, it's a little at odds, I almost want to say, with some of what you said about the Policing Gender project and how you didn't want to commodify your subjects or to sort of subjugate them to the gaze. But with Shimmer Shimmer, I wouldn't say you're commodifying the body, but you're definitely, by focusing on the print, by making the print the final product of this, in fact, not the final product, but the product of the work, that is subjecting yourself to the gaze in a way.
Yeah, for sure. I'm actually really glad you brought that up, because what's important for it is that it's really Sarah behind the camera. And so we're also talking about, Sarah identifies as queer femme. And so, I was like, okay, we wanted to do a project that was, the whole thing about me coming off of testosterone is like this exploration of, can I ever find my gender identity? Can one ever kind of define where our own identity, whether it's across many lines, kind of starts and stops between our internal and external factors? Is it always in relation to how I'm perceived by others? And being in a long-term relationship with Sarah, how I am perceived also impacts how she is perceived, and vice versa. So as a queer femme, she is often invisible as being queer. And when I, pass as male, we are invisible as a queer couple. We get read as straight all the time. And so we also wanted to kind of bring in, so not only it's about sort of me being like, I'm like as out as I possibly can as a queer, like a trans queer person, genderqueer, because I was getting so sick of passing all the time. And so I'm like, well, let me address that. And then, and Sarah actually had this vision, thinking back to that first picture of Venus, of me as Venus. And so that kind of started us off, but it's also about this idea of the queer femme gaze and forefronting that for a change, and thinking about, putting her there. And then I am also subjecting myself to the outsiders, like the viewer, right? And it's actually really funny because like literally we installed the show. I'm like going to bed that night, head hits the pillow, and I go, oh my God, people are going to see naked pictures of me. Like, it like literally hadn't dawned on me that it was like going to be public, because it was just something that like we worked on for so long. But I think that was like, I would never want to do that to someone else, but it also felt like urgent for me to do that, but for myself, but also to create representations. Again, the project is made in the context of the culture we're in, and as we're sort of in this era of culture wars once again, particularly during the Trump era, when I was making this work, and I think that presence, again, as opposed to the absence in policing gender during the time when trans stories were being kind of highly commodified and tokenized, during 2020, 2019, 2020, I felt like, thinking about the "we will not be erased" rallies and movement, right? So thinking about that as, okay, I need to do something to be as out as I can, as trans, queer, genderqueer.
Well, you can't make something more visible than put glitter on it.
Yeah, right?
Right?
Yeah.
I have another little question up my sleeve, but I actually just saw a bunch of questions come into the chat, so I think I'm going to hand it over to John to moderate those, because I think we should answer them.
Yeah, there's three really good ones here. Do you want to pick one? We've got Danny, Selena, and Sierra. All have good.
Let's hear them all.
Okay, so let's start with Danny. How did you compose the audio component of the figureless portraits? Like, how did you choose which aspects of the ambience and the dialogue to include? The audio creates such a meaningful connection with the individual without seeing them.
Well, thank you for getting that connection. That's really my hope, is that as you're standing there looking at some of these figureless portraits, that the audio would kind of wash over you. So I appreciate that comment. It just took a lot of time, just listening. I created it. There's like a Skype sort of function that you can do with many facilities, like with prisoners. It's very expensive, which is problematic, and a lot of my grant funding actually went towards that. But just so I would have interviews recorded, of course, with their permission, and then not with the prison's permission, with my pen pal's permission. I just did this all without working directly with the prisons, because I decided that kind of screw that. But yeah, so I just listened back, and just hours and hours of listening back and thinking about what I was feeling when I was listening to the stories, and thinking about what I was feeling when I was actually visiting the prisons. And I made the recordings. Like I said, I'd worked to gain access to a couple of prisons and jails, and I actually visited. And so I kind of made those audio recordings on the sly, and then incorporated them. And so I just kind of pulled what I thought was what was poignant to me, but it really just took just time to sit with it and work through it all. Thank you for the question.
So next question is, did either of you find or receive any type of validation that this career path was meant for you? And what struggles did you go through if you were looking for it?
Want me to start with that one? Actually, I would say, I was just talking about this with someone yesterday, that my career path as it is has always been looking for the next opening door. I've never had a path laid out before me, but I always look behind me and I'm like, wow, look at that amazing path. But really, I'm just here with a machete in my hand, right? The curatorial career, I never could have guessed that this is where I would go. When I was a kid, I either wanted to be an artist or a writer, and now I'm a curator and an art educator, and I do both of those things. So look at that. I followed my dreams and I didn't even know it. But I think particularly in terms of working with artists and working with queer artists, of course, there's certainly this amazing connection and validation I find working with these artists and sharing our own stories and our own experiences, because I also am queer. But beyond that, much like teaching, I found that there's this really wonderful sense of validation, sense of admiration in working with artists and creating a platform for their work, but also helping them to find new audiences and also find new ways to think about their work and talk about their work. And it's exactly situations like this, conversations like this, the fact that Lorenzo and I have worked in so many small ways in exhibitions over the years, and it culminates in this conversation we're having now, that's been really great for me. I've been fortunate not to have a lot of struggles on that path. Lorenzo?
Yeah, no, we were actually laughing about this the other day. We're like, it's totally easy. Like, what do you, no, so so validation, being here today, this is an amazing validation, right? I get to talk about my work. I get to have these interesting questions, like, thank you, right? This is it. This is what I've been working for, right? To have these conversations. So thank you all for showing up. And for me, I knew I wanted to be an artist. There was like, and I didn't know how. No one really knows how. There's no path, right? There's no way. But for me, it was just about, and it is continuing. It's a continuing struggle, but struggle might not be the right word. It's a continuous effort to keep applying for things, keep getting rejected for things, keep applying for things, keep getting rejected for things. And one of my favorite artists was talking one time, and he said, Dred Scott, he said, he and his friend have a competition to see who can get rejected for the most applications in a year. Because if you're getting rejected a lot, that means that you're doing your job, which is applying for as many things as you can. But like, I remember one year, I literally had to use like the last $35 in my checking account to apply for this photo competition. And I was so angry at the world for not valuing artists. And for being so broke, because all of my artwork was going to freaking oil paints to paint giant 4-foot paintings, and that's part of the reason why trans portraits took so long to make, is I was saving up money to buy supplies in between each picture. And I was working part-time I was working full-time at a photo studio, a commercial studio. And then I was working towards teaching I taught at a couple of community colleges at night, working towards my academic career and teaching, which I'm very grateful to have right now and be teaching. And then also working towards my art. And so short answer, you do what you have to do in order to do what you want to do. And for me, making artwork that is about, my lived experience on the world around me, that like, I have to do it. Like, there's no one's telling me to make these projects. Like, this is what I have to do. So, so we could talk about this for days and days, but that's it. Just like, stick to it is basically it. There's a lot of struggles, but also so much joy.
So I've got another good question here from Sierra. Is it hard to portray gender or non-conformative identity to a heteronormative audience?
So I will say that I have always tried to make my work for the people, like, who am I talking to? Who is this for? It's for me and my community. And the way that it's difficult to make it for, how did you say it? Heteronormative audience, that's kind of why I use absence, for example, in policing gender. So yes, it is a little bit difficult because I want to be sure not to be giving in to normative expectations and sort of, like I said, voyeuristic curiosity. So to me, I'm always like hyper aware. I try to be hyper aware of how my images will be read and understood by other people. And I think that's a responsibility of the artist all the time. How do you avoid stereotyping? How do you avoid making images that are offensive? So yes, but the answer to me is that I focus on, in trans portraits, there's no eye contact. That's on purpose. I'm saying, and it's photographed from slightly below so that everyone who goes and looks at those pictures is looking up slightly at the people in the pictures. So that's on purpose. So I work it into the way that I make the pictures, and I don't worry about trying to explain stuff to people. I'm doing work for my community and for me and to bolster us.
Jordan, I wonder if you wanted to respond to that too, like how you curate towards that.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I will jump on that. And what I'll say is that it's interesting because I'm thinking about the work that, as you were talking, Lorenzo, I'm thinking about the work that I've shown in the various exhibits I've worked with. And up until Nelson's show, I think that the work that I've shown from various artists has been perhaps less visually challenging for a general audience. I think a lot of the work you've done subsequent to Transportraits has been a lot more visually challenging. It's not so much that you've gotten into like a groove, as it were, but like you've pivoted a lot, right, to address both the change in culture, but also the change in yourself and your own understanding of identity, right? So I think that in some ways it's been interesting that I haven't had a lot of visually challenging work in the shows I've worked with. And what I have had, and I've been really amazed to have, is the kind of feedback that I've had at both at Penn State and at UArts, for instance, for where we find ourselves. There was a lot of interest. There were groups of people who wanted to come and talk about the work, classes, professors were bringing classes, professors from other schools were bringing classes to talk about the work. And that was really exciting, that people really wanted to dig into this work. And sure, there were definitely questions, some of which you might think of as being naive, coming from inside this circle, as it were, but very, very respectful. And I've actually found that the wider community has been increasingly accepting. Mind you, I live and work on a city on the East Coast. So this story could be very, very different if I were working somewhere else in the US.
On that note, I do want to also say, like, I don't like I do what I feel like I have a playful kind of aesthetic. Policing gender is different, right? Because I wasn't like whatever, but still using light in a way that I do feel like I try to make my images sort of accessible to a wide audience. And it's sort of about there's in my images, I feel like there's like a familiarity that people can latch onto, and then they are like maybe defamiliarized in the process of looking a little bit deeper, hopefully.
So I see that we're coming up on 1:15. So like all good conversations, we wish this could go on forever. But I will share with everyone in the chat our email addresses and also Lorenzo's Instagram. So those will be shared momentarily in the chat, and we'll leave things open for a little bit for anyone that needs to write them down. But like I said, we've reached the end of our time for this event, and I would like to thank everyone for joining us. I hope you'll follow the work of Jordan and Lorenzo moving forward if you haven't been already. Like I said, their emails as well as my own will be shared in the chat. And you're welcome to stay in touch or follow up with questions. If you'd like to rewatch or share this event, a recording will be posted on the Penn State Abington Art Gallery's YouTube channel in the next day or so. You can find it just by searching Penn State Abington Art Gallery. Thanks again for joining us, and I hope to see you at our future virtual and in-person gallery events and exhibitions.